something that I know because I've been studying the material. For example, Ethiopia is the second oldest Christian nation on the planet, right, after Armenia. And, this is something I've sort of taken for granted. I know the art that they produced in service of the, Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And I actually, one of the revelations was not about an object, but was about talking with one of my previous colleagues at the Walters. And she said, well, we're talking about Christian art here. We're talking about an icon together. And she's like, maybe you want to talk about how, Christianity and colonialism in Africa. And I was like, hang on. That's not the case with Ethiopia. Ethiopia was never colonized, only nation in Africa never colonized. And B, no, they've been Christian since the 4th century. King Azana adopts Christianity just shortly after, Constantine says, oh, it's okay to practice in the Roman Empire. So this is super early on. And immediately start, you see the cross appearing in coinage that the emperors are producing. And then, of course, later on, you see icons and manuscripts and wall paintings. So that was something that I kind of knew, but wanted to really bring that to the fore that, like, I think people, when they hear Africa and Christianity, they think one thing, but that's not the story at all with Ethiopia. And so it was more of a revelation, like what other people think and what other people's perceptions are of Ethiopia. So that, it's kind of maybe not what you're expecting as a revelation, but that was definitely for me, for sure. Also just thinking about how early on Ethiopia had relationships with surrounding cultures. The story that used to be told about Ethiopia was that, all these different people came into Ethiopia and they sort of changed the course of Ethiopian history. And I think it's, the narrative needs to be flipped at this point, really, and to think about, how is Ethiopia impacting moving outward and what were these relationships it had. So like, my big soapbox is always, people traveled in the Middle Ages, right? We think that because they didn't have planes or fast boats or anything like that back then, that people just kind of stayed in the town that they were born and that was it. And that's not at all the case. So even though, the journeys were hard, you could contract some crazy disease, all these various things, people did travel. They traveled to trade with other cultures. They traveled for religious purposes. They traveled just to explore the world. So as a result of that, you find, Ethiopia had connections with India going back to the 5th, 6th century CE. So, things that you wouldn't necessarily think would take place. So I think understanding that those very early long distance travel that happened from Ethiopia, that I think was a big revelation for me, and trying to understand, how much the story is shaped by a Western narrative of what happened in Ethiopia. And in fact, when you put Ethiopia at the center, you get a very different story. So, it's in the Horn of Africa, right? It's right located where, Europe and Asia and Africa all come together. So you've got, relationships across the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, up the Nile to the Mediterranean. So it's a very sort of expansive network. And it was one of the great ancient empires, actually, the Aksumite Empire from the 2nd to the 7th century CE. So, those are all the things that kind of struck me. And I think, so I first went to Ethiopia. I wanted to go for many, many years, but I finally went for the first time in January of 2020. And just to be there in that place and to, you're going to the palace of the Queen of Sheba, right? And you see the bones of Lucy, which was like, the first hominid, right? We're all descendant from Lucy, right? I mean, that's mind blowing. I mean, I think especially for, an American where our history, our recorded history doesn't go back that far. And so that I think that's one of the things that I hope people understand, through this exhibition, and sort of that deep, really long history, and kind of getting that in front of people is something I'd like to do.